Great. Thanks for the nice introduction, Rennie. And thanks everyone for joining us today. Looks like we have quite a bit of people on this webinar. It's really interesting. Cybersecurity is definitely taking off in terms of becoming a household topic. Everyone is concerned about it, and we're going to really look today at some of the things that everyone should be paying attention to in 2018. So just a little high-level roadmap of where we're headed today. We're going to look at some funding trends over the years and think about what that means for the year to come. And then we're going to dive right into the top 5 things that I'll be watching this year. But those are things like identity technologies, preventing fraud. We're going to look at how startups are helping enterprises secure credentials. We're going to look at what are called edge networks and edge computing and how that relates to securing the Internet of Things, and specifically the industrial internet or our critical infrastructure. And then we're finally going to take a look at something that's been around in cybersecurity for a while but is sort of getting a new face: firmware, hardware, and supply chain security. Now, obviously, there are more than these 5 trends that you should be watching in cyber. These are just the 5 that are most interesting to me. And then I'll continue with some bonus trends, roughly 8 other things that you should watch, but we won't deep dive on those as much. So, without further ado, let's take a look at some global equity funding trends in cybersecurity. And really what we're looking at here is a $21 billion industry. We've seen roughly 2,000 deals since 2013. And if we just break that out on an annual basis, we can see here very clearly that deals and funding through 2017 beat our forecasts. 2017 was actually a record year for cybersecurity funding activity. I mean, this really isn't surprising given the prevalence and rising severity of the hacks and attacks against businesses and governments and individuals wanting to protect their data more. And clearly investors are taking note. I mean, we saw 552 deals in 2017, and we saw that funding in terms of dollars invested in equity deals really doubled actually last year since 2016. Now, there's a caveat there that I'll explain in a second, and that's that 2017 actually saw a record number of what we're calling mega rounds. These are rounds of funding for $100 million or more. And we actually saw 10 of those deals in 2017. You can see those companies listed off to your right here. These are all the cybersecurity startups last year that got these mega rounds. Now, you might say to yourself, what is McAfee doing on this list? I thought that was Intel's security arm, a public company. Well, just to clear that up, it's interesting here. McAfee raised a $2.3 billion private equity round from a firm called Thoma Bravo in April. McAfee, yes, was acquired by Intel in 2010. It was then spun out. Intel retains 49% ownership of the company. So it's important to know here that we are including that PE deal in this 2017 funding total, right? Just a note there. Mega deals, though. And this is also a really interesting slide. We can see here that more investors are flocking to cybersecurity than ever before. And this is really evidenced by the fact that we can see rising numbers of new investors year over year, with 2017 topping all the previous years before it for all types of investors. VCs are still the most active funders for these companies, but we can also see that corporates are really getting involved at an increasingly high rate. And if we look at the deal share over the years, we can see that early stage deals actually fell to a 5-year low. And we can see that investors are beginning to favor a little bit more of those growth stage deals in the Series C, and especially E+ stages grew in 2017. Next up, this is a really interesting slide. Everyone has always said how great the Israeli startup ecosystem is at producing these cutting-edge cybersecurity technologies. And while we've all known that for a while, it's now finally showing itself in the data. And this is evidenced by the fact that Israel is now second to the United States, above the United Kingdom, in terms of the number of deals to private cybersecurity companies since 2013. Now, it's also important to note here that while it's clear the US takes this outsized share of the deals, like roughly 70% of the world's cybersecurity deals go to US-based companies, Silicon Valley in particular, but also Massachusetts, New York, these places are still magnets for cybersecurity professionals in a way that Silicon Valley used to be for maybe semiconductor technologies, right? People are still seeing these as places to go to grow your company. So while Israel may be second to the United States, there's still quite a bit of the successful startups in the US in cybersecurity actually come from Israel and set up shop here later, and then we begin to count those deals as US-based companies. So just a little caveat to the data there, but we can also see Canada in the mix and Chinese startups in the mix as well. So let's take a look now at the 2018 cybersecurity trends to watch. Our first trend is around identity technologies. And where is this coming from? It's coming from the idea that more than ever, our personal data is online and it's subsequently vulnerable to abuse. I mean, really, surrendering personal data is now ubiquitous with being online. You can't use Facebook, Amazon, Apple products without surrendering everything from your face data to your purchasing habits, etc. Things that can be used to identify you, right? So we don't really own that data anymore. But we're seeing this reflexive trend here where people want to own that data. They're becoming more privacy conscious as a result of a lot of breaches. We'll get to that in a second. But startups are actually rising now to help us prevent our personally identifiable information from ever leaving our control. And just a note, we're going to refer to personally identifiable information as PII from here on out. Additionally, we're seeing another trend, and this is around regulation technologies, what we'll call RegTech startups. These companies are helping enterprises comply with rules and regulations about protecting PII, but mostly around ensuring user privacy. And CB Insights does a lot of research on RegTech if you're interested in that, and we'll talk about this in a second. So, like I said, PII is more available in the wild, on the dark net, and available for exploitation than ever before. I mean, these are just some of the major breaches we saw in 2017. Yahoo, maybe the largest breach ever, 3 billion accounts, 200 million registered US voters saw their credentials exposed online, 146 million people in the Equifax breach, maybe half the US population. The list goes on, right? So what comes next once all this information is out there and available for exploitation? Well, like I said, we're seeing a number of startups rise around the idea of privacy and anonymity online. So I've picked a company here called Orchid, and you can see here Orchid is backed by some blue chip investors, Andreessen Horowitz, Draper Fisher Jerviston, Sequoia Capital, etc. Right? They just raised that series or that seed VC round last year. So what is Orchid, right? Well, Orchid is an open source overlay network that runs on top of the existing internet. It's fully decentralized, right? So rather than traffic being routed through central authorities like your internet service provider or your VPN network, it's routed randomly through a network of bandwidth contributors. And these contributors all sign up to share with surplus bandwidth on their computers, and they activate these devices as nodes in the network, right? So users that want to access an uncensored or anonymous internet, we'll call these people bandwidth consumers, they pay the bandwidth contributors in Orchid tokens. This is a peer-to-peer currency exchange network like the Bitcoin blockchain, etc. But because neither the traffic nor the payments can actually be monitored by central authorities, both the contributors and the consumers of bandwidth enjoy this fully anonymous and what Orchid calls a surveillance-free experience. So there's a reason I chose Orchid as the first company to highlight here. I think that this is going to be the future of the internet as people realize more and more that they truly don't own their data. And we could see people switch over to Orchid-like protocols into the future. But I'll also draw your attention down to this quote in the bottom right by the founder of Orchid Labs, where he's essentially saying that centralized systems, where we store all this really important information in one place, these clearinghouses, open up a whole new type of vulnerability whereby things are just easy to get in one place versus decentralization. It's harder to get, maybe it's user controlled, etc. But my point is here that this is actually a much wider debate taking place in the technology industry today. And this is concerning centralized versus decentralized applications, right? So even Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook is one of the largest brokers of digital identity on the planet. He came out recently in an open letter and he said that this debate is actually going to be a part of his thinking about Facebook's next steps this year. So what we're seeing is that this push for decentralization is being felt by these enterprises that are now forced to form a response to the fact that consumers are now more aware and more concerned about their digital security with a specific focus on privacy. So enter Orchid. Next up, we're seeing this idea that enterprises are now legally bound to protect a user's PII. This is primarily being achieved through the EU's General Data Protection Regulation. I would encourage anyone who's interested in this to actually go in and read the law. It doesn't just apply to companies in the EU. It really applies to companies all over the world that deal with the PII of European Union citizens. This affects American companies as well. And effective May 25th, any organizations that are not in compliance are going to face heavy fines. And I think in 2018, we can expect the regulators to make some examples, especially for international companies here. So what is GDPR? Well, at a very basic level, there's three main ideas that I've pulled out of it that I think are really important in coloring our conversation today. The first is right to access. This means that people now have a right to know if personal data concerning them is being processed, where it's being processed, why it's being processed, and how. They also have the right to be forgotten. This means that you have a right to erase your personal data, to cease its dissemination, and to halt the processing of that data. That's a big one. That's huge. And then privacy by design. Now, it's important to know privacy by design has existed for years, but it's now a legal requirement under the GDPR. And what this means is that designing systems at the outset has to include protecting user identity. And this is especially important for manufacturers of internet-connected devices, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So, given this trend, we're seeing the rise of several different classes of startups. And this company that I'll highlight here, Privatar, is one of those companies. It's part of a rising sector that I'm calling data confidentiality, but I've heard others call it confidential computing. This is actually the trend I'm most excited for in 2018. These startups are allowing the sharing and operating of sensitive metadata without decrypting anything. Other companies in this space can allow for running identity-secure enterprise applications in public cloud environments with complete privacy from the cloud provider. So you have a company like Privatar. It allows organizations to mine these data sets that contain sensitive PII and to manipulate them and perform calculations on them while also preserving the privacy of the individual data subjects in the data set. This is going to be a big space moving forward, not just because of GDPR, but this is really what people are concerned about. They want to know that if a company takes my personal data and they perform calculations on it, and maybe they do that through a third-party service provider, that my individual granular data is still secure and keeps me private, but that the company I'm surrendering my data to can still do what it promises, right? They can still give me value based on that data. So Privatar is one company that's helping to do that. Good company to keep an eye on. Next up, we're seeing Fortanix, and Fortanix is really focused on that idea that a lot of these data breaches, specifically that breach we talked about where 200 million registered US voters saw their credentials exposed online, well, that's because they were hosting really sensitive data in a public cloud environment. I'm not sure which cloud that was on, but just know that was the case. So Fortanix is saying, we can come in, we can allow you to run these public cloud applications securely, even if they contain sensitive data, right? So this means that no cloud provider, no service provider, not even Fortanix, can actually access the client's sensitive data, such as maybe their user's PII. Very interesting. Something that makes Fortanix unique here is that they can actually do runtime encryption. I won't go into that, but just know data, it either sits someplace, it's either exchanged between devices, or it's being used, and they can pretty much secure it at all elements of that stack. So good company here to keep an eye on. Just raised that Series A last year. Next up, we're looking at Wirewheel, and this is again part of that RegTech startup landscape that CB Insights has some research on. You should check that out on the blog if you're interested. I won't go into detail too much here, but just know that these companies are applying AI, machine learning, etc., to make sure that enterprises are GDPR ready and that they don't fall into non-compliance with a lot of those privacy laws. So that's a good trend to keep an eye on as well. So next up, we're looking at fraud, and this is part of this identity space, right? We're seeing all these credentials out there in the wild. It opens up, more attack vectors for fraud, right? And we're seeing online transactions in particular are rising in incidents of fraud, right? So this is in part due to transactions that process multiple currencies and payment types, in addition to a number of other factors. But we're seeing startups that are starting to curb online transaction fraud by verifying people's identities, so verifying legitimate users, also spotting fraudsters, finding the bad guys, and then also some companies that are coming out with some really interesting ways to track illicit finance. Something I really want to draw your attention to here. This is a quote by Brian Krebs. He's a journalist and investigative reporter and a really important figure in the discussion around cybersecurity today. And what he's saying here is that when you have a breach like Equifax and you see the full suite of consumer information, right? So everything you would need to construct a digital identity for someone, when that goes out the door, when that's in the wild, we're no longer looking at fraud as just a case of accounts being taken over, meaning I get your password, log in as you, and do some bad stuff, right? Now, we're actually seeing the creation of totally fraudulent accounts, what's called a synthetic identity fraud. So these are completely fake individuals made up of stolen PII as a result of these breaches. And this is a different problem than account takeover. Enter a company like Unify ID. These startups like Unify ID can implicitly authenticate people using a number of factors beyond their traditional PII, beyond their credentials, right? So Unify ID is part of this behavioral biometric space, and we've seen companies in this space before. It's not necessarily very new. It's often called the immune system approach, right? Where they're monitoring different parts of how you walk, how you type, etc., to create this user profile for you. Essentially, they use the smartphone sensors, like your accelerometer, your GPS, etc., and that forms this baseline understanding of your behavior. And it pulls this information into sort of a machine learning back-end process, builds your profile, and then it can flag anomalies when people, try to impersonate you, and they can't fake all of these things, right? No one can steal your walking gait necessarily. And it's important to know that companies like Darktrace and a few others, more well-funded companies have been around for a while, are doing similar things here. But you can see here, Unify ID raised that $20 million Series A last year. So this industry is still developing, and companies are still raising slightly larger early-stage rounds. It's indicative of the fact that this is still a space that needs to find its really robust solution provider. So I'm going to keep an eye on Unify ID to do just that. Next up, we're looking at FeatureSpace. And again, this is a behavioral analytics company. FeatureSpace is interesting. It was created by Cambridge University professor Bill Fitzgerald and his PhD student Dave Excel. They were studying data science and computer science around the same time. This company is really focused on blocking fraud in banking, payments, and gaming. I've mentioned Darktrace, that company, a few times, also came out of Cambridge. So we're seeing some interesting stuff come out of that university when it comes to behavioral analytics and anomaly detection. Feature space here, specifically applying that science to fraud detection in real time. Next up, a company I've been following for quite a while now. You can see they got their first funding back in 2014. They just got a little incubator accelerator round last year, Elliptic. Elliptic is pretty cool. The technology they use is capable of tracing an entity's transaction activity as it occurs on the Bitcoin blockchain, right? So they can't see who is behind these nodes necessarily, but they can trace the relationships between these nodes in the network, and they can flag the riskiest relationships and then pass that information on to law enforcement professionals so that they can go investigate and remediate whatever's going on, right? But on top of that, Elliptic's proprietary database also delivers audible proof of identity for Bitcoin addresses. So this is really going to be increasingly important as Bitcoin gets bigger and bigger, because there's still this age-old argument that the currency is just used for fraud, right? For money laundering and other types of illicit finance. So Elliptic could be central to correcting that and potentially play a big role in that debate moving forward. So this brings us to our third trend to watch in 2018, and this is that credential theft is here to stay. Now, we all know that most cyber attacks are traced back to the theft of login credentials. These login credentials, like your password, your public keys, etc., they all enable hackers to gain entry to proprietary networks and systems and steal data and do other bad things, right? So startups are continuously building technology to stop the primary way in which attackers often get a hold of these credentials, and that's through a social engineering scam called phishing. And phishing really involves obtaining login credentials by posing as someone trustworthy in like an email or another form of electronic communication, okay? So we're seeing some startups offer, again, keep in mind here, decentralized storage for sensitive credentials, not centralized. Like I mentioned here, phishing is getting more attention. It's almost a household name these days, and we can put some data behind that using CB Insight's Trends tool. If you haven't seen this before, this is a really impressive tool that we offer to our clients on the platform. We can mine a massive corpus of media articles, and we can enable this data-driven, real-time method of discovering, predicting, and really plotting the arc of rising attention to emerging trends. So what we're doing here is we're using Boolean logic, and we're applying that to millions of media articles, right, all over the world in multiple languages, and we're looking for the term phishing, right, as it relates to cybersecurity. And we're comparing that to mentions of password theft, logins, compromised logins, social engineering, account takeover. And you can see phishing, again, like I said, has really become this household name. So we're seeing a lot of startups developing tools to specifically attack social engineering and phishing scams in particular. So IronScales, an Israeli company actually here, can do a number of different things around training people to combat phishing scams and a number of other sort of like automated incident response services. KnowBe4 is an interesting company. So they're really focused on this idea of training employees in your organization to recognize when they're being socially engineered, to recognize those red flags. And they do this partly by testing customers' employees with simulated phishing emails to kind of get people prepared for what it might look like if they were getting phished. You can see here that Goldman Sachs invested in this company, and I think that's really interesting because Goldman doesn't tend to invest in companies at like a Series B stage unless they're really interested in the TAM, the total addressable market that this company has. So what that says is that KnowBe4 is really onto something. Hans Scherman, Vice President at Goldman Sachs Merchant Banking Division, said that this is a need to have for businesses across sectors and geographies in the fight against cyber threats. Next up, we'll look here at a company called Hyper. everything from door locks, cars, connected homes, medical devices, critical infrastructure that we'll talk about in a little bit. These are all part of this growing world of IoT, IIoT connected devices, right? And these devices are all housing credentials for us. Specifically, a lot of these credentials that we use to log in are moving towards biometrics, your eye scans, your face data, your palm print, etc. And Hyper is offering us a decentralized way to store those credentials. And again, without being centralized, it limits the probability of a mass credential breach. It's a New York-based company that I'm for sure keeping an eye on this year. You can see they got some investment there from MasterCard. Next up, I want to talk about edge computing, and I want to talk about how it relates to the Internet of Things and the industrial Internet of Things. So if you're not familiar with edge computing or edge networking, this is a term that was coined by Intel or Cisco, one of the two, quite a while ago. It's not super new, but we're seeing it come into its own now with the advent of AI in devices. You should check out a company called Mighty AI. This is a company that wants to put an artificially intelligent chip in everything from your car to your toaster, right? So what we're seeing is edge computing is this new era of IoT, right? Whereby intelligent machines can make processing decisions locally without actually contacting a centralized authority in the cloud. And that this really complicates the ability to secure these devices when they have to communicate with one another. They also have to authenticate each other, trust each other, and relay that information back and forth, right? So startups are actually developing technologies to help us identify and authenticate these autonomous machines. And I just thought I'd point out here that, again, what we're also talking about is the fact that infrastructure and devices are already super vulnerable. We've seen a number of experts all over the world predicting this idea that infrastructure is super vulnerable. 2018 may be the year of the critical infrastructure attack. Well, edge computing devices in these networks only complicate things. So we'll talk here about a company called Dragos. It's a Washington, D.C. based company. What I really like about Dragos is that they're industrial cybersecurity focused, but that they have investment from this firm Data Tribe. You can see there it's listed as a corporation, but Data Tribe is a $35 million fund with some corporate sponsors, Deloitte, Allegis Capital, which you can see is also an investor in this company, and Yahoo Japan, right? And so this company, or Data Tribe, really invests in companies with founders that have gone toe-to-toe with the bad guys, if you will, like really experienced people who know what they're doing. And so I always tend to take a look at their companies. And Dragos, because they're in that critical infrastructure space, is one I'm definitely keeping an eye on here. Next up, we'll look at a company called Filament. Now, Filament isn't cybersecurity through and through. They're really more focused on building these edge computing networks in the industrial IoT, right? So autonomous drone networks, trains, construction equipment, etc., that can all make these local processing decisions. But on top of that, they're embedding security into the DNA of these networks, and that's super important moving forward as more and more things get connected at the edge. And then our final trend that I want to look at today is something, again, like I said, it's been around in cybersecurity for a while. It's the idea of firmware, hardware, and supply chain security. If you're not familiar with firmware, this is software that comes preloaded on your computer, your smartphone, your other devices. It's permanent software that actually governs the device's hardware operations. Like, you can think of it as built-in operating instructions. And this has historically not been an area of concern for a lot of CISOs and other people who are charged with securing devices and networks. So it's really seen as a defender's blind spot, if you will. So startups have been developing this technology, but we're seeing this new face come on for organizations to help them defend their firmware, hardware, and supply chains. And the reason supply chains relate to this is that oftentimes the hardware components of a device may come from multiple places all over the world, and then they get assembled someplace. And somewhere along that supply chain, if there's a vulnerability, an attacker can get in there and install malware, etc. And then when the device comes to you, the user, it's already infected, right? In a way that allows people to siphon data from it or even completely destroy the machine at will. So we'll take a look here at a company, spin out from Intel Capital, Eclipsium. This company is actually located in Oregon. I think it's really interesting, you know, at the super early stage like this, you kind of look at a company's use case, you make some sort of estimation about the total addressable market, and then I really like to take a look at the team. Before launching Eclipsium, the CEO of this company worked at Intel in its former security group, McAfee, and he identifies himself as a former chief threat researcher for Intel Security. But before that, Yuri Buligin, the CEO, actually spent 3 years at the Russian cybersecurity firm Kaspersky Labs. So an experienced individual in his own right, definitely a company to keep an eye on. Next up, we're going to look at another data tribe company, Refirm Labs. And Refirm Labs is really focused on protecting those firmware vulnerabilities in Internet of Things devices. And again, taking a look at the team, knowing what kinds of team data tribe invests in, this comes as no surprise. Terry Dunlap, the CEO and co-founder of this company, is an NSA veteran. Peter Eichmann, the CTO and co-founder, spent 12 years as a nation-state hacker for the NSA, FBI, and U.S. Special Forces. Definitely a company to keep an eye on. So here I've got 8 more trends that I'll be keeping an eye on in 2018. We're not going to really deep dive into these, but you can see hybrid cloud security, this idea that enterprises are migrating operations to the cloud. They're keeping some of those things in public and private clouds, hence the hybrid nature of this. And this opens up a whole new vector for security concerns. Startups are really rising to tackle this. One I like in particular that we've featured in some other research is called Obsidian. You can see here, number 2, development security operations. This is really interesting, and it really relates to that idea of privacy by design that's being championed now legally by the GDPR. And this relates specifically to IoT manufacturers, in my opinion, but it could relate to a number of other things. And these are companies that offer products and services for developers to create privacy by design, or security by design, really, in their applications, devices, etc. So this might be a way to put encryption protocols in your applications, etc. So this could be really big moving forward. Next up, automotive cybersecurity. It's been talked about a lot. We haven't seen too many moves in this area. I like a company called Upstream, got funded recently. We just know that cars are increasingly connected and autonomous, and that's going to be a big vulnerability moving forward. Insider threat detection. I like a company called Wiretap. Threat intelligence. Interested in a company called 4IQ that we've reported on recently. Deception security. There's a few companies here to focus on. If you're interested in that, I can talk about it in some more research. Visit the CB Insights blog, type it in, you'll find some stuff there. Healthcare IT security. This relates to everything we've been talking about, from data privacy to securing the IoT. These organizations are increasingly vulnerable, and it's about time someone did something about it. Then finally, without a doubt, we're going to see the continued importance of companies that are offering cyber posturing and the ability to measure and negotiate cyber insurance premiums. So just a few other trends that I'll be keeping an eye on this year. So that really concludes the presentation for today, and I'm going to go ahead and just give us a second to write in some questions, and I'm happy to answer them. I think we still got plenty of time today, so let's see what we've got. So I'm getting some questions here about insurance and sort of these other trends that we talked about. I'll just go back to the slide here. You can see it's number 8 there. People just want to know what I'm seeing there, what's going on with cyber insurance. Well, I can tell you that we've seen data that direct premiums written just hit $1.34 billion in 2016. It's estimated that cyber coverage could actually increase by $8 billion to as much as $20 billion by 2020. So this spike in potential growth has actually resulted in both insurers jockeying for position as well as the formation of a host of new startups in this space. And we have plenty of research again on that on the blog for you guys to check out. Another thing is that there's this noticeable announcement in 2017 by AIG. They're one of the largest direct premium underwriters for standalone cyber insurance. They basically announced that they would add cyber coverage to their commercial casualty insurance in 2018. Big development there. So that's sort of some of the stuff we're seeing in that space alongside the development of startups. Somebody's asking, why is our critical infrastructure so vulnerable? This is a little bit beyond the purview of this webinar, but I'll just say that it has to do with the fact that lots of these systems and a lot of the hardware devices in our critical infrastructure are legacy systems. They're old. And then we've got a mix of new infrastructure being put on top of that. That creates some complexity in securing those devices. But then we've also got this idea that there's a mix of vendors and suppliers supplying different security to these places, and that creates more complexity. And then there's also this idea of the convergence of traditional IT security and OT security in critical infrastructure. If you're interested in this, go check out a webinar that we recently did called Securing the Connected Enterprise. We really deep dive into that idea. Okay, I think we have time for one more. I like this question. It says, what trend do you feel represents the largest opportunity or future market size? It's hard to predict the future, but like I said, the trend that I'm most excited for this year and continuing going forward is this idea of data security, data privacy, everything from how companies are going to respond to GDPR and the tools and startups that they're going to use to do that, and then also how companies are going to keep their data, on their users secure using companies like Privatar, another one called Enveil, etc. So that's a huge market, especially as regulations take hold and force organizations to deal with this. Unfortunately, I don't think this idea of privacy and anonymity, like that company Orchid, is really going to take off in this huge way yet. I think these are still companies that are coming out with really compelling white papers, and the idea is there, but we haven't seen mass adoption yet. So I hesitate to say that that's this huge future market for those companies, but I wish it was, because I think it's some really cool tech coming out of those companies. So I'm seeing a lot of people are asking about cryptocurrency and how that relates, and there's obviously some considerations around fraud and cryptocurrencies that relate to some of the stuff that we've talked about. But I think the biggest thing is how is the underlying technology, blockchain, going to be used to create these decentralized applications for securing us? And that's a big trend that I talked about and will continue to watch moving forward. So I think that's all I'm getting a signal. That's all the time we have for today, but I really want to thank everyone for joining us. This is one of the largest cybersecurity webinars we've had in terms of attendance. It's been my pleasure speaking with you, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'll try to get those answered for you as quickly as possible. Thank you.